Well, I'm joined now by the SNP's Ivan McKee, a member of the Scottish Parliament's Finance Committee. And in Edinburgh, we're joined by the Conservative Dean Lockhart, who is a member of the Economy Committee. Well, Ivan McKee, first of all, this thing about economic growth. I mean, Derek Mackay said he would prioritise economic growth in his budget. And the conclusion of the Scottish Fiscal Commission is not just that the budget will have no effect on economic growth at all this year, but it will have no effect over the 5 years that they are forecasting.
Well, I think you also had David Bell talk about the fact that these things take time and it's a longer time frame you need to look at. Another very important...
So what is the time? I mean, I get the point of not an immediate effect. Let me just read you. She says, the policies announced at draft budget 2018-19 are not expected to have a significant impact on the economy over the 5-year forecast period. Now, I take your point about some of these things are long term, but, you know, for a budget that was prioritising growth to produce no growth seems a bit of a contradiction.
You've got to look at that in the round. The biggest issue she identifies in the report that's holding back growth is Scotland's population demographics that you also talked about there as well. And the biggest issue that's driving that is what's happening with Brexit. And if you look at the numbers that they've used in that report, they've used a more aggressive an assumption on population growth, which is more constrained than that used by the OBR down south. So what they're talking about, they've taken the lower profile from the ONS. So what that's saying is that Scotland's going to be impacted more by the population issue that's caused by Brexit than the rest
take your point
of the UK.
About the population.
That's the issue that's causing the biggest
Derek
impact
Mackay
on growth.
knew that before he produced his budget. So why did he therefore then say he would prioritise economic growth when he must have known that for the reasons you've just given us, actually his budget wouldn't have any effect on it?
Well, that's not true, because if you look at the situation, unfortunately we don't have any control over Brexit. If it was up to us, we'd be staying in the single market and we were driving Scotland's population growth through that mechanism. But unfortunately that's not open to us. What the budget did, and if you look at the quotes from business leaders and the CBI and the FSB and the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, they're all welcoming what's been done, the steps that have been taken to help stimulate growth, be that round about the business rates only going up by
but it's not going to have any effect, according to the Fiscal
Commission. Well, I think that the question is, if you've got to look at it in the round, and if we hadn't done those things...
Well, sorry, when you say look in the round, you mean...
If we hadn't done those measures, then the situation would be worse. That's absolutely the case.
Oh, so
and that's what you're hearing. You're hearing business leaders congratulating
sorry, is your argument now that there may be no economic growth as a result of the budget?
No, what I'm saying is, if you look at the full report, what that report talks about the growth that you've talked about in that statement, and it also talks about the impact of population. And as David Bell said, and as Susan Rice said, population growth are the constraint on it in Scotland.
But
it's a huge impact on the economy.
My point is Derek Mackay knew that when he said he would prioritise economic growth.
Unfortunately, we can't bin Brexit, otherwise we could. The reality is, if you look at what business leaders have said, they welcome the rollout of broadband that David Bell highlighted as and the huge investment by the Scottish Government.
All these
things being a Westminster Government responsibility, we've put £600 million into that.
What do you make of this idea that a budget for growth is no growth?
Well, it's interesting. Ivan McKee says these things take time. The SNP have had 10 years to grow the Scottish economy, and over that 10-year time, the Scottish economy has consistently underperformed. Now, on the budget, what Lady Rice said was that low productivity was one of the key drivers of the lower forecast for the next 5 years. Now, the way to address productivity is you increase skills in the economy. This budget has just made Scotland the highest tax part of the UK for skilled workers. So and every leading business organisation has advised against it. So what we're going to see is the skills gap worsening, and that will have a cumulative impact on productivity. So there's a downward spiral happening.
But hang on, if Ivan McKee is contradicting what Susan Rice said, then you are contradicting what Susan Rice said, because the Fiscal Commission came to the conclusion that the relatively small increases in tax would not have the deterrent effect that you've just described.
Well, that remains to be seen, but I think it's relatively small when you look at it on an individual basis. But leading organisations have said that disposable income in Scotland is already lower than elsewhere in the UK. Higher tax will mean that people have less money to spend in the economy, and that will have a negative impact on the economy. This higher tax, the NAT tax, will also result in business costs in Scotland being higher than elsewhere in the UK.
Okay, all right. Look, just on this question of tax, the other thing, a lot of people who are going to have to pay this extra tax might make them think twice, is the fact that in her document, Susan Rice forecasts that tax revenues next year, in the 18-19 financial year, will actually be lower than forecast by the OBR only a month ago before taxes went up. So in other words, you have tax rises which actually produce less revenues, or maybe they would have been higher if you hadn't put the taxes up.
The OBR forecast at a UK level.
Yeah, but they also forecast Scottish taxes.
Yeah, but they both use a different basis for the calculation than the SFC.
Well, that's not a point that the
taxes are going up by 500 million next year, income tax, of which 164 is due to the tax changes that Derek Mackay's made. And I think, going back to the point that Dean Lockhart's made, it's ridiculous to suggest that for the sake of £2 a week, somebody's not going to move to Scotland when they get free tuition fees for university, when they get free prescription, when they get a much better health service than down south. And talking about skills, if you look through the detail of the budget, we've invested an extra 9% in real terms on in further education, further education colleges in Scotland, and a huge investment into steps to work on the employability schemes to help get people back into work. So the investment in skills and training from the Scottish Government is a significant part of what we've done to boost economic growth through this budget.
Is it, Dean Lockhart?
Well, look, the SNP are long in policy, but in terms of the impact it's had on the economy, the figures speak for themselves. The 5-year forecast is for economic growth in Scotland to be below 1%.
Yeah, well, but hang on, just to be clear, I think the point the SFC is making is that that tax revenues will be lower than were expected by the OBR a month ago, not because the Scottish Government has put up taxes. It seems to be mainly a reflection of their forecast for lower than expected economic growth. That in a way has more effect than what you do with the tax rates.
Gordon, I completely agree, and that's why our absolute priority is to grow the economy, because if over the next 5 years growth in Scotland could match the UK, then public spending in Scotland would have an extra £2 billion. So this increase by the SNP has increased £160 million for the budget, but actually if you had an absolute commitment for economic growth, you're looking at an extra £2 billion for Scottish public services over the next 5 years, and that is our absolute priority.
Okay, give me one idea, because we're running out of time, that you think they should have done, something that would actually make the economy grow faster and therefore bring in more tax revenues?
Well, we would like to see the Scottish Government work very closely with the UK Government on its industrial strategy. There's £20 billion being spent by the UK Government on improving productivity, innovation and enterprise. And if the Scottish Government could really get Scotland to the front and central of the UK industrial strategy, I think we'd see a big improvement in the economy.
Okay, Luke, you're defending the SNP, but you're a former business person. You could have ideas of your own. If they called you in and said, one thing we could do that we haven't thought of, what would you say?
Well, I think from a business point of view, the issues around about skills availability, which I've talked about, infrastructure, we've talked about investment in broadband and talk about investment in transport infrastructure is critical over the coming period, and that's happening. And the other focus is the National Manufacturing Institute, which is going to give a real boost to high-tech manufacturing.
But anything they should have done that they're not doing?
Well, I think those things cover off what we need to do. I think that's what's important. And you've got to remember that the tax situation, a lot of that's because of what we've had to do.
But hang on, so even though the SFC is saying it will have no impact on economic growth, you think they've done everything they could possibly have done?
Well, you've got to remember that Scotland controls very few of the economic levers, most of the economic levers, most of the tax levers.
Yes, but that's not what Derek Mackay said.
Capital gains tax, or all of those things are controlled from
He
Westminster.
said prioritise economic growth.
And that's exactly what he's done within the constraints.
Even though there's no growth?
Within the constraints of cuts from Westminster, within the constraints of budget, within the constraints of Brexit driving the population in the wrong direction, and within the constraints of the vast majority of tax levers are still controlled with Westminster, given the limited hand he's got to play with, I think he's done the best he can.
All right, Luke, we'll have to leave it there. Ivan McKee and Dean Lockhart, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.